I'm excited to be joined today by Dr. Michael Bernstein. He's an experimental psychologist and an assistant professor at Brown University Medical School. Dr. Bernstein's research is focused on the overlap between cognitive science and medicine, studying the role of expectation in healthcare and leveraging the placebo effect to improve patient outcomes. He's the author of The Nocebo Effect: When Words Make You Sick. Mike, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thanks for having me.
A lot of people have heard about the placebo effect. What is the nocebo effect?
So the nocebo effect is, in essence, the opposite of the placebo effect. The placebo effect being an improvement in symptoms due to the expectation of getting better. And then the nocebo effect, which is sometimes been called placebo effect's evil twin, is a worsening of symptoms due to the expectation of something getting worse.
Is this related to hypochondria or when you can anxiety yourself into symptoms?
So, yeah, it would be related. I think it's probably a little bit of a different phenomenon, though, because well, maybe it's more related than I my initial reaction was, because it really does hinge on this topic of expectation. So I suppose if a hypochondriac was really like expecting to get sick all the time, you can definitely see a strong parallel with nocebo. Classic examples of nocebo, maybe the classic example would be that oftentimes in randomized trials where some treatment like a drug or, a good recent example would be the COVID vaccine, the active treatment is being compared to a placebo, like a sugar pill or, a saline injection in the case of a vaccine. And there you will often see some side effects among people that are actually in the placebo. And so that's like a classic example of the nocebo effect where, they expect to feel some symptoms because they think they might have been given the real drug. And so as a result of that, they do feel symptoms.
Oh, there's a tough trade-off there between the sort of ethical, necessary medical disclosure, listing out all the symptoms that you could get, but then it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And based on this placebo-nocebo research, it could almost be better to only talk about the benefits.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny you say that. So that's the exact sort of ethical dilemma because physicians and I suppose all medical providers, they have two goals. One is, or two requirements, I should say. One is to work on helping their patients get better. And the other is to, treat patients with respect, which at least in America, there is some cross-cultural variation here, but at least in America means being fully honest and transparent with your patients. And nocebo really highlights how in certain circumstances, those two goals are uh, in competition with each other. And, the best way at times to probably have a patient to enhance the well-being of a patient might be to not tell them about certain side effects. And so that is the tough trade-off. And, in the book, which I'm actually an editor of, not an author of, but a chapter was written on like what physicians can do. And there have been some proposals for ways to work around this. And, one of them, which I think is very interesting, proposed not by myself, proposed by others, is you do what's called authorized concealment. So you go to a patient, like, if you're going to a doctor and getting a new drug or something of that nature, a doctor could say something to you like, so there's some side effects here. I can tell you about them if you want. However, me telling you about them might increase the likelihood of them happening. So, like, it's up to you. I can disclose those or I can not disclose those. And then the patient can make their own autonomous decision about what they prefer. And, there's other variations people have talked about where, you could like have uh, a patient tell like a family member about all of their symptoms. And then if there's certain symptoms that are very worrisome, then the family member would be able to know if that person should see the doctor again, or if it's just, like a headache that's no big deal or something of that nature.
I like that disclosure idea. I think it would help avoid this WebMD effect. I know there's anecdotal experience. Do you know of actual published research on this?
Of um, people sort of talking themselves into illness by Googling their symptoms.
Yeah, exactly. You Google your symptoms, and then obviously it's just talking about anything that could be related. So, you have a headache. What if you have a brain tumor? You have cancer,
Right.
and then you can just psych yourself out into that, even though it's missing the sort of Bayesian probability of base rates.
Yeah, exactly. There's less on the, what you nicely call the WebMD effect. But it's, I would say, very similar and maybe even kind of the same phenomenon has been studied when it comes to media reports. Um, and so, again, the Nocebo book, there's a chapter, Kate McCrill would be the author of this one, talking about how, like, when there's media reports of some side effect from a drug, you, in the instances that she's looked at, see a big spike in how many patients start to then report having that side effects, which I think would probably be sort of the same thing as like what you're talking about with WebMD or Googling your symptoms.
Right. So I know neither of us are clinical psychologists, but there seems to be a lot of overlap between
Mhm.
anxiety and, at least anecdotally, I know that if I'm anxious about something and start Googling it, often I'll take those pieces as evidence and start feeling it kind of in this nocebo-like way. Like, I don't think I would have recognized that until I Googled it. And
Yep.
then you read it, you start thinking, wait, am I having a slight heartache or something?
Right. Yeah. Maybe the classic example here would be, the number of people that mistake a panic attack for a heart attack. Um, uh, yeah. So, you're right. And not a clinical psychologist. And you're getting at something important that academics in this area aren't always perhaps as careful as we should be, which is, drawing carefully kind of the boundaries between, what constitutes a nocebo or placebo effect and what's something sort of adjacent. And, my colleague Charlotte Lease has written about this. And so that the topic of anxiety, uh, yeah, it's sort of a tough one because maybe you can make an argument it's a type of nocebo, and you could probably make an argument that it's something a little bit different than that. Um, but certainly, I think it would be true that people who are just higher in trait neuroticism are going to be more likely to, whether it's a nocebo or whatever you want to call it, sort of have the worry of something going on and then be more vulnerable to suggestion through Googling symptoms or those kinds of things.
The earlier you mentioned that it all boils down to violation of expectation or just expectation effects generally. And I think part of the reason when I have these anxiety spirals,
Mhm.
if I'm researching symptoms and one of them might say something like shortness of breath, and then I start paying extra attention to my breath, but normally it's automatic. You're not paying attention to it whatsoever. So it's almost like the uncertainty starts to grow. Like, I don't realize because I'm not paying attention to what normal breath feels like most of the time. You can just fixate on the regular inflation of your lungs. But if it's feeling unfamiliar because you're paying hyper attention to it, you're just like, wait, I'm feeling my lungs more. Am I feeling
Yep.
them more because I'm paying attention to them or because it's shortness of breath? And it's just all of that uncertainty can psych you out.
Yeah. And so this gets at kind of the psychological mechanisms of and this probably applies to both nocebo and placebo as well, um, which would be either, amplifying some feeling that you have, or, yeah, I guess it would actually be more amplification. The other one is misattribution. That's a little different. And so, like, I think a good example with this would be, and probably a lot of your viewers can relate, when COVID hit. I mean, any little headache, little sore throat that I got,
Mhm.
my introspective cues or introspective awareness were hyper focused on it. And so just like, I could probably get a headache because I missed a cup of coffee. And so like I was slightly caffeine deficient for the afternoon. And then, 2 hours later, I'd be concerned that I was in the early stages of coming down with COVID. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, it's definitely related to the fact that when you're worried about some kind of illness, you really pay attention to your body much more closely than you do day to day. So I love that shortness of breath example because I can see how you normally don't really think about it. And now you're thinking about it and sort of like, geez, maybe my breath is a little bit short. I don't know. Um, and so you can certainly see how it would become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I like thinking about it in a systems neuroscientist way. Like if you
Hmm.
think about prediction error just at the basic neural level, and that you have this sort of low road up from the sensory systems, and then you also have high road prefrontal cortex making broader predictions, more abstract about your environment. Like, is there COVID in the air? That's fascinating that we can think of that and even represent it because it's pretty new just for, as an evolutionary phenomena to even know what germs are, that there could be this
Yep.
invisible thing that can get you sick. But then I could think that's so powerful that it could easily go out of line where your cortex is just coming up with these abstract threats and then signaling down that threat signal down to the amygdala. And even if your environment is fine otherwise, it's like you're getting this top down threat signal. So does that sound right for neurologically how the placebo or nocebo effect might be working? As in, it's more about top down prefrontal cortex predictions, positive or negative, that don't necessarily align with bottom up sensory input, but you can't disprove it either. So then you can kind of just run with that in either a positive or negative feedback loop direction.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, and so I have zero neuroscience background, so I can't speak too authoritatively on it. But there have been people working in placebos who have been conceptualizing it right along what you're saying in terms of a Bayesian perspective. And, there, the idea has to do with, what happens when there is a discrepancy between the expected feeling and the expected feeling and the experienced feeling. And so that delta can be, according to some models, sort of considered to be like a fundamental cause or a mechanism of placebo or nocebo.
Mhm. It's making me think of fear conditioning studies and
Mm.
looking at amygdala activity. And again, it can come up in this bottom up way. Like there's just an actual threatening sensory stimulus. And the cool thing is that these bottom up subcortical processes respond so quickly that you might not even enter cortical or conscious awareness. They're like these threat priming studies where you flash an image of something threatening, like a spider on a screen, just for a millisecond. And you ask the person consciously, did you see anything? They'll say no. But just for that millisecond, you see a little spike in amygdala activity registering the threat. So
Huh.
physiologically, you see that just for a brief millisecond. And that corresponds with these other bottom up physiological arousal, like, just for that millisecond and onwards, slightly increased heart rate relative to baseline. The cool thing about that is it completely bypasses the conscious awareness. But then you have the flip side to that, where let's say you don't have any threat from your environment whatsoever. You're watching a scary movie, and it's just one of those things where the music slows down or the room is dark and it's doing those camera pans in the empty room, and you
Yeah.
just know that something's going to happen and you start getting tense. But
Yep.
again, from this systems neuroscience perspective, well, that tension can't be any sort of bottom up amygdala signaling responding to a threat in the environment. It's, if anything, it's more like an eerie absence that your cortex is predicting. And then it's signaling back down like, wait, something must be wrong. You better generate that increased heart rate and that increased skin conductance because something's about to happen. So I think that's really well established just for, I think for fear, that that's the best example, but a lot of emotions seem to work with this parallel of either bottom up response to the environment or top down predictions. So I like thinking about placebo nocebo in this way, that it's probably when you have disproportionate top-down predictions. Because I don't know, would you say that this nocebo effect, that fear of a scary movie is kind of like that because the environment itself isn't telling you something, but you're just creating fear out of nowhere based on prior knowledge?
Yeah, yeah. Think I think there probably is a lot of overlap between that and a nocebo. Yeah, so I think what you're getting at, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that expectation is inherently a top-down process, but by and large, um, our sensations are bottom up. Is
Mhm.
that where you're going? This?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be interesting to talk with a neuroscientist on, but I would bet that you're right about.
Mhm. Yeah, that's an oversimplification, and I'm still in training, but you are talking to a neuroscientist about it, so that's
Oh,
my
okay.
best guess at what's
Great.
going on.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Um, yeah. Yeah. And the sort of the parallel, I guess, of this is, you might find this interesting that um, there are a number of neuroscientists that study placebo. And so, you might find some of the research, you could get a lot more out of it than I ever could, where they look at like different brain regions that are affected and, how it works at the neurotransmitter level. And so that might give you kind of that might help you think about it a little bit more if this really does fit that top down model, which
Mhm.
again makes a lot of intuitive sense to me based on what you're saying.
Yeah, and I know your research is more behavioral and experimental,
Mhm.
but I think there's a lot of nice overlap just
Excellent.
thinking not necessarily with neural mechanisms, but with pure cognitive mechanisms like
Mhm.
statistical learning, what's going on. I think you also see some nice parallels between that and even just classical conditioning, because not only classical conditioning, it's sort of a learning in response to your environment. You have some innate stimulus, and then you compare it with something else. But there's also a ramping up and ramping down of that looks a lot like statistical learning. It's like you don't just immediately jump to having the classical association. It takes repeated trials to build it up. And then if you take away the paired stimulus, you get this extinction effect. And then if you reintroduce it, you learn it faster. So there seems to be some latent memory that's stored somewhere in the
Mhm.
brain. But
Mhm.
all of that on a more macroscopic lifespan level, I just think whatever is enabling us to learn these placebo or nocebo effects, like it certainly applies in healthcare based on all of our prior knowledge about positive and negative side effects. But just thinking about social expectancy effects more generally, if we're these social statistical learning creatures and we go out in our environment and what the cortex is doing is building this predictive model of the world, then, well, you always run the risk of overfitting or overgeneralizing to something that isn't actually there. But most of the time it is adaptive. Like when you and I, we're not even physically here in front of each other, but there's just enough reliability in the fact that the photons emitted from the screen and the sound waves emitted to our ears in real time allow us to act as though we're interacting in person. And really not much is different. Like the more you pause to think about how insane that is in this cortical way, the more it's surprising it is that it works, but it seems like it's so automatic, but that it also makes sense that because that's so automatized and that we're making these constant predictions, well, they can go wrong just a little bit. And we seem to observe that with placebo nocebo effects.
Yeah. Yeah. And the conditioning piece it's really interesting to think about with placebo, I guess either placebo or nocebo, but right now I'm thinking about placebo effects because, you have to wonder, to what degree is a placebo effect just the classically conditioned response of I take a pill, I get better, and you do that over the course of your life. And then now you're enrolled in some trial comparing drug to placebo. Um,
Mhm.
and so, there's a way in which that could be like a classical conditioning. And people have studied that, they've done these conditioning studies to look at if you can condition a placebo response. And, the answer is yes, you can. You can get there through conditioning, or you can get there through um, conscious expectation manipulation, or even some have looked at unconscious expectations. The designs of those studies are uh, lost on me at this exact moment, but there's like a pair of studies that came out maybe about 10 years ago that looked at that. So, uh, yeah, there's a lot going on and a lot of different mechanisms that could be explaining it. And I certainly think conditioning is probably one of them.
Mhm. But this is getting even more speculative. But I think that since you study this in the context of the healthcare system, I wonder, like you said, that could be a product of lifetime classical conditioning based on just prior experience with medicine working. But placebo doesn't seem to apply just with actual medicine because of our knowledge of medicine. It could even apply with like your mom as a kid makes you tea and says, "You have a tummy ache. This is going to make you feel better." I
Yep.
mean, that could be true. It could be something chemically about the tea, but it could also just be this broader sense of nurturance that your mother tells you to calm down, everything becomes fine again. You have a little anxious child getting these bottom up sensory stimulus from the upset stomach, causing
Yep.
this emotional discomfort. But even a child can have this sort of top down inhibition. And if they're going to filter their worldview through the eyes of their parent, there are these little developmental studies showing that if a parent freaks out at something minor like a fall, that can scare the child and then it can turn into crying. But if the parent just is like, "Oh, you're fine," or kind of laughs at it, the child might laugh too. So they
Mhm.
really seem to mimic and magnify whatever the parent's response is going to be.
Right. Social learning. Yeah. So a couple of interesting things you touched on, and uh, I, I have a research assistant that's getting into this literature. But it's been, there's one theory evolutionary psychologists has proposed that some of what we are calling placebo effects, it, let me see if I can try to get this argument correct. Um, or maybe I think it actually might be more general than placebo effects, but that there's a sort of, it's something sort of adaptive from an evolutionary perspective of signaling to your community. um it sort of serves as signaling function to the people around you, like, signaling that you're sick in some way and in need of comfort, which is, I think, right up what you're getting at with like what a mom does with a kid, makes tea or whatever. um and so, yeah, I don't know, this is sort of a very loose connection, but it reminds me a little bit of what you were saying. And also just kind of a funny story. Like, I was talking to someone who, um, reporter actually, about placebo effects, and she said something. She was sort of laughing when she made this comment. She was like, "Oh yeah, in our household, band-aids are our placebo." It was like, we
Mhm,
throw band-aids on our kids for everything, even if it's not just a cut, and then all of a sudden they feel better.
mhm.
And certainly, like, a parent like kissing a child on a scrape, that would be, you could think of as another example of placebo. Though funny enough, maybe that's a little bit confounded with like the physical touch aspect. So
Yeah.
physical touch can be therapeutic too. Um, but yeah, a lot of interesting threads there.
Mhm. It's cool to think about when a ritual works, and let's say the explanation for it is completely confounded. So, like, the Band-Aid example, maybe it's not the Band-Aid, but the fact that while you get the Band-Aid put on you, you're caressed and kissed and, like, it's gonna be better, and maybe those have the effect. So it could be placebo, but I'm also thinking of these evolutionary anthropology studies, and it's this idea that, like, a culture can develop some mythology or ritual, say, around certain food practices, and they could have just completely non-scientific explanations for why this is going to work. Like, I don't know, you boil the food because when you boil it, you're imbuing it with energy from the fire, and fire is like a life force from your sun god, and that
Mhm.
energizes the food, and then that makes you feel better than if you don't boil it. But then, you could also just apply modern uh, knowledge of microbes and that boiling is actually going to kill the bad pathogens. So, like, both of those stories work. The interesting thing is they could just parrot that complete mythology, but as long as the outcome works, that's going to be evolutionarily stable. So it's not like it's selecting for truth per se so much as functional utility.
Yeah, and I wonder about this actually with acupuncture, where they have these very complex ideas of the different meridians that's going through your body. And, you know, I, um, I don't know what to make of that theory, but like I wouldn't be surprised if there's things that are effective for reasons totally different than the ones being hypothesized.
Mhm. So, earlier we were talking off camera about psychoanalysis and its overlap with modern cognitive psychology. And again, this is extremely speculative, but I wonder if one of the things that could be going on when you have, especially from a doctor, this placebo effect is your brain could abstractly represent something like trust and authority. And the psychoanalyst would say, that you scaffold that representation based first off of your parents, but then you can generalize it to other adult authority
Hmm.
figures. And to some level, you're going to project that on the world around you. And certainly, just from more cognitive social learning, we know that doctors being high prestige positions that are very knowledgeable and that are going to do good to heal you. I mean, all of that, again, you can come up with the scientific explanation. Like, but I don't know if people automatically are thinking so cognitively about it, especially children. Like, you could think, this person has the coat and the stethoscope, which represents years of study in medicine. And that years of study means that they know all the precise chemicals, and the chemicals are going to save me. Like, it sounds so complicated, but it almost seems to be more this gut response where if you trust a doctor just because they're this big authority figure, you could also have the opposite. Like, when you think of someone who is afraid of going to the doctor, it's probably not going to turn into this whole cognitive conspiracy of actually they learned the wrong thing in med school and the vaccine is going to pump you with a microchip or something. It's probably more just some sort of bottom up emotional fear. And then you have maybe post hoc conspiratorial rationalization, but we do that a lot. This is kind of like the confabulation in split brain studies. Like, you're doing something with the left half of your body that's controlled by the right hemisphere, and if that's split from the left language hemisphere, and you ask the person with language, what are you doing? And they'll just confabulate a completely different reason. These split brain studies that I'm talking about?
Very vaguely. It's been a while. I understand the general premise of what you're getting at, but
Yeah. So I just wonder how much confabulation like that might be happening. Same thing with placebo effect.
yeah, it's a fascinating thought. I hadn't considered it. And I think what I'm hearing you say is there might be something kind of like, to use the psychoanalytic language, transference going from a patient to a doctor. Um, Transference from probably whatever their childhood relationship is with their primary caregivers.
Hmm.
And if it's a trusting one, then, it might result in them trusting the doctor more and presumably having a stronger placebo effect. Um, and if not, then um, not such a strong placebo effect, or maybe even a nocebo effect, the opposite. And I think I my anecdotal sense is exactly yours, that a lot of people who distrust doctors, um, when you try to sort of engage them on it, and look, I'm far from someone who believes that uh, doctors should be trusted without any questions at all. So, I have um, I'm not all the way on the other side of the distribution. But the people who are very distrusting, it does seem when they speak, it does seem to be like you said, a real sort of gut level instinct of like, oh, those people they don't know anything. They just, whatever, they just make you worse. Or it's a very kind of emotional response. And you don't really get an argument, or you don't even really get much of a cognitive thing happening when you engage with them. Um, all of this would be interesting, and it would be a very cool study to look at. And people have tried to predict, what the predictors of placebo response, are men different than women, and et cetera. Personality traits has also been looked at, and there isn't really a lot of consistent evidence, actually, to my surprise on that one. Um, but it would be interesting to try to look at that according to attachment styles. Because if there
Mm.
were a difference, I think that would be supportive of the idea you're suggesting. And wouldn't shock me if there were.
Now, what about neuroticism and nocebo effect? Is there a stronger link there?
Neuroticism in nocebo. I'm trying to rack my brain to think of if this has been studied. The personality stuff has mostly, probably almost exclusively been on placebo. Again, I think it's maybe a bit arbitrary to even draw kind of a distinction in this way between placebo and nocebo. I think probably mechanistically it's going to be extremely similar what's happening because I think sort of nocebo is just the other side of the same coin of placebo. Um, so I can't really speak to nocebo specifically, but when it comes to placebo, um, again, those links are very inconsistent. I think there have been some studies that finds a relationship between neuroticism and placebo response, but um, it has not been replicated enough to my mind where we can uh, speak with much authority on those personality correlates, which surprises me actually.
What about strength of the effects generally? Because in behavioral economics, one of these classic cognitive biases is a negativity bias. So
Mhm.
if that's true, that could generalize to whatever the effect in either direction. Maybe it extends farther. There's more room for harm in nocebo just because we tend to be more attuned to these potential threats.
Yeah, that's a great point. I, to my knowledge, that exact question hasn't been looked at. If like you can basically get people further from baseline from nocebo versus placebo.
Mhm.
Um, uh, I'm sorry, could you repeat the first part of that? There
But
was
it could be further from baseline, or it could be it just takes less information or less stimulus in the same way that for behavioral economics, like this pretty strong negativity bias. If you ask someone, would you take a bet that's 50-50, you win $12 or lose $10, a lot of people are going to be pretty hesitant, even though expectant value is positive. But if you say $20 versus $10, then it seems to be like you need this 2 to 1 that negativity seems to have
you
twice
know
the weight.
2 to 1. Wow, just amazing how strong that bias is. Um, yeah, I would kind of bet you're right. I would bet you're right. And so I'm thinking now about like some of the studies that have been done where you get, um, you know, eh, it's hard to prove. Well, it's basically impossible to prove the negatives. So we can't say unequivocally that certain kinds of environmental factors, things like wind turbines, um, power lines, those sorts of things have no negative health consequences, but we very much think that they have none or, it's trivial if there is anything. But you do get nocebo effects there where people who like live near these environmental things like wind turbines will report more health complaints after the turbine goes up. Um, and it's just making me think that I can't recall an example in the literature of the opposite happening, where there's some environmental feature that goes into place that might improve symptoms due to a placebo effect. And so I think that would be consistent with your idea of this negativity bias. Um, yeah, that would be interesting to study. And I bet you're right.
Well, I bet that if there was some sort of environmental stimulus that made things a little bit more positive, people would feel it, but they wouldn't attribute it to that. They would probably just internalize it. So this is almost like an inverse of fundamental attribution error, where like someone cuts you off in traffic and they're a jerk, but you cut someone else off and you have good reason because you're late for work or you're taking your wife to the hospital, whatever it is. So like if it the reverse of that would be you get something positive that's placebo like, but you can't trace the cause. And maybe you just did something right. You got out of the right side of the bed, or you're patting yourself on the back for something that you would have
Oh,
done
that I've
anyway.
been eating my vegetables a lot the past few days.
Yeah.
I'm feeling better. Yeah. Yeah. Uh, yes, I could absolutely see that. Good point.
This is reminding me of this other recency bias that we have. So I've seen a set of studies on colonoscopy procedures in men, and how there's going to be some sort of natural level of discomfort having the probe, and you could just end it there when it's most painful.
Yep.
And doctors, because of this recency effect, have figured out that if they actually make it go longer, but then make the end of it purposefully less uncomfortable, people will remember it as overall more pleasant. Even though the funny thing is, you think about this from like a utilitarian perspective, total amount of comfort or discomfort.
Yep.
They're adding discomfort, but because they're adding a lesser discomfort, like that just averages out to how uncomfortable you remember the experience being. And patients, they report greater satisfaction or less dissatisfaction
Yeah, I
with the
love
whole
that
thing.
study. Yeah. Yeah. Um, so, what's the parallel that you see there?
Well, I wonder if this could be brought into nocebo effect at all? Like, let's say you're talking about potential side effects, but you also include something like, these side effects may get better with time, which is probably true. Like there's enough of a hedge there. And I wonder if that would be enough just because then you leave room for more possibility, or
Oh, I
there's some sort of, so it's not recency effect exactly, but just this idea that people aren't necessarily going to cling on to the most negative part of the experience, but if you give them more wiggle room, that could bias their whole perception of the thing.
right, or even you could even go more extreme and, if you're getting a new treatment, the doctor could explain all of the side effects and then talk about all the positive effects.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't think there's any work on that, but it's an interesting thought.
So, how experimental actually is this? Because, when I was taught about this colonoscopy study, I think it was used as the textbook example of here's a way that cognitive biases actually impacts healthcare and the way we practice things. So, at this point, it seems like it's standard practice, and yet there must have been some intermediate period. Is it the case that there's often like constantly new types of interventions, or like what you just mentioned, in one set of patients, the doctor tries this set of wording, in another set, he does something else. And then just over time, you start moving towards what proves the data shows to be most effective?
Yeah, I think probably what happens in the real world, just Google for a GP near you or some kind of specialist is, I think by and large, they are just kind of not just, that's a little too extreme. They are basing what they do off of their clinical experience and their sense of what works. Um, I don't think it's the case that very often they're really following the literature on these topics and trying to make a research informed decision along those lines.
It's surprising to me that in the places it matters most, like in healthcare and education, you think we'd constantly be testing out new randomized trials at a population level just with minor changes. The ironic thing is that that's exactly what social media companies do. Like constantly, they're testing some hidden change on a subset of their users. And then
Yep.
if that subset has higher engagement, then they roll that out as the big change in the next update.
Yep. Yeah, and probably just about any big sized or even medium sized business, they have an R&D arm to their business for a good reason. And then I think you're exactly right. In medicine, um, it's a little bit trickier. And I think a very good example of this, and there's an excellent book out. I could, I think it's called Surgery, the Ultimate Placebo. Yeah, that's the title. And that goes through the evidence that even surgeries, the most invasive thing, ones with very high risk, starting with the anesthesia. And, I mean, surgeries are obviously high risk for a variety of reasons. Um, it is really shocking how little evidence there is that many surgeries are effective over and above placebo. Um, and there have been not many studies on this, for obvious reasons. It's quite difficult to do a placebo controlled surgery study. But, and I'm thinking now in the orthopedic realm, there have been at least a handful. Um, and to my knowledge, I don't think that there's been any one study showing that the surgery is better than the sham surgery. Uh, a very famous article came out in the early 2000s. It was published in New England Journal of Medicine, where they looked at this for knee pain. I forget the exact technical name of the surgery, but it was, commonly done surgery. And I think it might even still be a commonly done one. And they followed patients up for, I believe it was a 2-year period. And they had this really nice design. They got either two versions of a real surgery or they got a sham surgery. And they did it in a way where actually the surgeon was blinded, to which they were doing, because they had some like computer screen, where the surgeon can sort of see what's going on. And the placebo arm, they had a way of making it so that the person didn't know that they weren't really operating, because they wanted to hold the amount of time that the patient was under anesthesia constant, because they didn't want, you could sort of break blind, you could know you were in the placebo arm if you got out of the surgery quicker. So very, very well done study, and no difference between the two. If anything, a very admittedly small signal that actually the placebo surgery was better, funny enough. Um, uh,
In the
so
placebo surgery, they cut them open and then just sewed it up and didn't do anything inside?
correct.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, you can see how controversial such a study would be, but if we want to actually know if a surgery is effective over and above an expectancy effect, just in the same way you do RCTs for drugs, that's how you would test it. So, uh, I would argue that we should be doing more of those studies, even though they obviously pose a lot of potential risks. And, you've got to be very mindful of what you're doing ethically. Um, but, if we're going to be practicing surgeries on a wide scale with thousands or tens of thousands of patients, to me, it seems like a worthy investment to have a study of a few hundred patients where half of those get a sham surgery, you know, consenting to it, knowing that they might get the sham surgery, being given the opportunity to get the real surgery afterwards for free. All of those safeguards in place. I would argue that is a important societal benefit to be done. Not, I can't do it for all surgeries, obviously, but for like elective procedures, things focused on pain relief, which um, now there's a lot of, especially with kind of an aging population. To me, that feels like important research to do, but needless to say, there's not a lot of it happening.
Mhm. Yeah, that would be great. And thinking again psychoanalytically about the placebo effect, I just imagine the alternative would be such a cognitive dissonance. Like I just cut myself open and got spent a bunch of money and spent all this time in recovery. And then to even allow the possibility into the room that it didn't do anything. I mean, what's more interesting to me is what the mechanisms would be. Like, I could easily imagine getting into a psychological state like, "This had to have worked," and then you go looking for positive side effects, but, I mean, maybe it's that, maybe it's the expectancy effect, because it could be expectancy, like, physiologically, that actually kicks in some processes of your body's own healing that wouldn't have otherwise happened, but it could also just be psychologically, like, you're on the lookout for more positive and less negative, so it's just an attention bias thing.
Yep. Yeah, and it could be, and I mean, I suppose these aren't mutually exclusive, but you're talking about ritual. It could be that like there's this real ritual. You go, you get your pre-op visit from a surgeon. They say yes, you're good to go. You schedule the surgery. You go in at 5 a.m. because surgeries are always really early in the morning. Not 5, but you know probably 7 or 8 a.m. Um, and then there's a ritual surrounding, what happens post-op, um, recovery, all of that. So like that could be a factor. And I wondered too, and I'll have to defer to you as with the neuroscience, but I mean, could there be something happening where in the acute phases after a surgery with the increased pain, might there be some sort of endorphin type of an effect going on that could be curative? You can
Mhm.
speak to that better than me.
I don't know about curative, and you're right that it would be short term. So, yeah, that's just interesting to think about,
Yeah, right. And curative is probably not the right word, but promoting some type of symptom relief.
right? This is also reminding me of these studies on daylight savings time and health outcomes. Have you heard of these?
Yeah, like more traffic fatalities and right after daylight savings.
Right, and more heart attacks, but then less when you get the hour of sleep.
Yep.
Now, I had always interpreted that as more of a physiological stress thing, like an hour of sleep can really make the difference at a population level when you're talking about people who are just below or just above the cutoff for some injury. But
Mhm.
then now this is making me think, well, people are pretty grumpy when they lose an hour of sleep, like not even just physiologically, but you're kind of complaining about the whole daylight savings thing and everyone's just in a bad mood. And then similarly, everyone's kind of happy when they get to sleep in. Now that's making me think maybe it's less about the sleep and the physiological stress so much as just this collective air of satisfaction or dissatisfaction on those mornings.
Oh yeah, yeah, I could see that. Um, yeah, maybe I would imagine that's also just confounded with I mean, I would assume that mere sunlight exposure is probably has health benefits. So that
Oh,
extra
yeah. Mhm.
sunlight. But if it were that, then you would expect to see a benefit maintained beyond just the immediate, 2 or 3 days of daylight savings. So that probably rules out that as an explanation. Yeah. 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 So like a kind of like an effect of enhanced or worsened mood that is a feedback loop with your social environment.
Mhm. Yeah, that would be difficult to test, but I'm sure
Yes.
there
Yeah.
must be something like that going on. This
Yeah.
is also making me realize we've been talking pretty much exclusively on these types of biases from the patient perspective, but there's also those biases from the doctor, as in they're going to look for positive side effects and report those. And if it's not double blinded, then you could have that type of bias in all of the data that we're looking at.
Yes, absolutely. And that is a very interesting area which I've started to dabble in more recently on yeah, bias from the physician side. Um we started to think about how this might work with using artificial intelligence in, my department of radiology here. Um and so yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a very good point.
I've heard some preliminary studies about AI having way better success rates than actual radiologists at detecting, say, small tumors or whatever the illness is going to be. And, even if we're not right at that cutting edge yet, certainly within a decade at the rate that facial and visual recognition AI is going, we probably will reach that point. And yet, here's another ethical dilemma. I imagine there's probably going to be a lag between AI being better and yet not having it be standard practice. And then there's an opportunity cost of lives that comes with that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things going on there. Certainly, I agree that standard practice, and this isn't just radiology, I think this is anything. I mean, standard practice is going to lag behind research evidence. Don't totally know why, but obviously we would expect that to happen. When it comes to radiology, I guess this applies to other fields of medicine. There's questions around insurance and how that all works. Um, but there's something also interesting too about the psychology from the patient perspective. Um, like, maybe you by the nature of what you do and, being younger would have a different intuition. But, if you were told, well, you have two options, like this X-ray to see if you have whatever, some kind of abnormality. It can be read by an AI machine, or it can be read by, a real human who's spent, years in medical school and in training to read X-rays. Which would you prefer? Um, Again, perhaps you might be a bad example. Probably most people are going to just feel more comfortable with uh, the radiologist. And so it'll be interesting to see how this landscape changes. I think for at least a long time, and this is something that we've been kind of researching in the department. My colleague Grayson Baird has been leading the charge on this, is looking at the interaction between the radiologist and the artificial intelligence program, because that's really where it's going to sort of be hinging on for at least quite a while. Um, I find it hard to believe that we're just going to have AI machines in the background doing everything. There's going to be no doctor that is involved in the process.
Right. Yeah, when I reflect on that, I think that I would want both. But then if there was disagreement between the two, what would I want? I have no idea, but
Yeah.
I imagine the AI would be cheaper and more scalable. So it would be interesting if we could get to a place where that was just the first screening preventative medicine. Like everyone can do it on
Yep.
their phone or in a more hands-off visit. And then the doctor being the more premium resource, then if there's any preliminary reason to think something's wrong, then you get to go see a doctor. So then that seems like a win-win because it both saves resources and it gives people the comfort. And maybe there's still at this point something extra that the doctor provides that's more trustworthy.
Yes, exactly. And, in a similar way, this has been how, in some contexts, people have thought about AI and radiology is as a sort of triaging, where you, you segment out the instances where you're not worried that there's anything going on with the patient from those where you think there could be something happening. But yeah, I like your point. You could imagine that if you have some kind of, I don't know, some kind of issue where you want to be seen by a medical professional, like maybe there's concern that it could be, um, a serious condition. Like I could see how you might have something where like you're evaluated by an AI algorithm, whatever being evaluated by AI means. You have some inputs fed into the AI, and then if it determines like, 99.99% of the time, patient with this profile is healthy, they don't even need to bother being seen by a doctor. And then if it reaches some thresholds, whatever that is, um, some threshold established in advance, then that person goes and sees a doctor. And, that has the advantage of like, even if, even if you can only sort of segment out, 10, 15% of patients is saying, nothing going on here, like that could still be a major advance when it comes to the healthcare system as a whole.
Hmm. Does your research touch on these ethical considerations of, well, sort of like data privacy and how to do that in an effective way that and like what are the downsides to something like that?
Let's see. So the downsides to data privacy, could you explain a little more what you mean by that?
Not downsides to data privacy, but with regard to data privacy, thinking generally about downsides of this type of more computerized, automatized, personalized medicine, because then that's going to be very sensitive information that's going to
Yes.
exist within some medical database, which, if it's doing its job right, that's great. But it's also an added point of vulnerability that we might not have previously had.
Yeah, no, we haven't thought about data privacy from that standpoint before. I see what you mean. I guess the question I would ask though is, the counterfactual is still that you provide that data to a physician and it probably gets stored in some online database there as well.
Hmm.
So I'm not sure if I think it's totally correct and fair to point out that there is a privacy concern. I don't know if I inherently see a greater privacy concern
Right.
with.
Yeah, I guess this is more my sci-fi mindset kicking in.
Okay.
Like
Uh-huh.
when I think of things like 23andMe or Ancestry DNA, which
Yeah.
I've done, and for the
Okay.
most part, a lot of people have done it, and it's just a cool thing to learn about your ancestry, but it's also your whole genome that they have. And for the most part, we don't have any extra uses for that, but there could be a bunch of uses for it in the future, positive or negative. So then when you think of something like just having your whole genome sequence, which is already pretty cheap and easy, and will probably get even more so in the future, maybe to the point that it can be just standardized medicine and that you have as part of your regular doctor's check-in, like genetic markers, maybe even epigenetic markers, as in like how have things changed in response to these environmental stressors that you've encountered in the last year. That all still sounds positive. I don't know what's spooky about it.
Hmm.
It's it's only like in this sci-fi dystopia that it starts to seem risky, where it's like, you get your genome sequenced, and then I don't even know what the downsides to that could be, but something that's more targeted, like it's almost like kind of related to the eugenics fears
Mhm.
where people talk about designer babies and
Yep.
optimizing for different health markers, but that also means you're screening out other unhealthy populations, but that exist today. And then you get into some borderline cases like the deaf community, for example. If you have a child that's going to be born deaf, well, one thought is you screen out for that, and you can even do like gene editing to make it so that they're hearing, but then the deaf community, it's not just an impairment, but it's its own culture and it has its own language and all these things that you have to take into consideration.
Yeah. Well, and I also think it touches on a sort of autonomy issue because, uh, not everyone, but certainly many people probably will not want to know if they have certain genetic markers of various illnesses.
Hmm.
And so if there were some kind of data issue and I don't know, data leaked out, you can see how a person might be presented with that information sort of against their desire to even know it in the first place.
Hmm. Right. So that's cutting edge in a way that's more sci-fi, not even something to worry about in the next couple decades. What's the cutting edge of the practical research that you're currently working on, Mike?
Yeah, so I'm finishing up a study, or we actually did just finish it up. We haven't analyzed the data yet, where we haven't had a chance to talk about this, but within the placebo field, there's something called open label placebos, where someone takes a placebo knowing that it's a placebo. And
Mhm.
so, there have been a number of studies on this. Um, I just wrapped up a project where we took patients who were being discharged from the emergency room at a hospital, all of whom received a prescription of opioids like Percocet, um, for whatever, conditions could range quite widely. Things like a very bad sprain or a fracture, um, things of that nature. And so they were all being discharged with opioids to help with some type of acute pain problem. And then we randomized them to an open placebo condition where they were also given these honest placebos to take or not, the not being the control condition, with the goal of seeing whether or not people in the open placebo group would take fewer opioids than those in the control group. And so, kind of in the near term, I'm looking forward to seeing what those data come up with. And then, depending on how it looks, there might be opportunities for doing some follow up studies to try to get at that, um, get at that question a little more.
Yeah, that makes me think again of these top-down versus bottom-up neural mechanisms, where even if you know it's placebo, well, then probably it couldn't be some sort of top-down prediction
Yeah.
unless you're predicting a placebo effect. But in this bottom-up way, like you take a pill, and even at an unconscious level, there must be some sort of statistical learning going on that just like the receptors in your tongue even, and you swallow it, like I wonder if that's enough of a ritual that could be encoded in this more subcortical way unconsciously that still produces those results even if there's nothing cortical going on telling you this is the medicine.
Yeah, I love the fact that you brought up ritual a couple times because it hasn't really been studied experimentally, but it's certainly talked about a lot. Um, and I don't know if you're familiar, Jerome Frank wrote a book in the early 70s. I think it's called Persuasion and Healing. And he kind of goes through a lot of like, he talks about religious healing as an example and things of that nature. And, you really are left with the impression that um, throughout much of human history, there has been a real ritual that is just deeply embedded into any kind of what a shaman or a doctor does. And I would argue that's no different today. We might not have priests that do the religious ceremony at nearly the same frequency we used to have. But I do think that there is a very much a ritual around, the white coat and the stethoscope and the waiting room with the crappy magazines and like all of
Mhm.
that. You kind of view it as a ritual. And that, as you brought up, would be much more of a bottom up way of bottom up method of healing rather than top down.
Mhm. Yeah, that reminds me of white coat syndrome, this idea that your blood pressure could be higher just because you're anxious being in the waiting room.
Yeah, 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 exactly. Um, yeah, though I wonder if that's your anxious being, let's see. So I've always interpreted that as the anxiety of um, being about to discuss your health with a provider and maybe learning
Yeah,
some bad
mhm,
news. Yeah.
yeah, that sounds right. I wonder if this could be replicated in animals at all. Like, a lot of it is just gonna be you need this higher order cognition that they couldn't represent abstract things like efficacy of medicine, but I'm imagining if it was the same type of classical conditioning study or like a drug study, there's plenty of studies on addiction in rodents.
Mhm.
And I think that the classic studies, if they're looking at withdrawal effects, they simply don't give them the drug. But I wonder if they gave them something that uh, was looked identical and maybe tasted identical, if they could manage that, if you'd still see a withdrawal effect. And I mean, you probably would if it was a really addictive drug, but I wonder if they could show statistically significant decline in the magnitude of withdrawal and if that could be taken as evidence for something like placebo, even in rodents. And that would be really cool because then you're one step closer to really understanding the neural mechanisms and saying that this isn't uniquely human, but it is this bottom up thing that's shared across mammals.
Yeah, and it's been a long time since I've looked at these articles, but there definitely are ones that touch upon that. I have to kind of dig through my library to find them, but um, yes, people have looked at those types of questions in animal models.
That's cool. So thank you, Mike, for your time. Is there anything that you want to discuss on practical implications for this, or just anything we haven't talked about that listeners should know?
No, I think we covered good ground. I appreciate you inviting me on, and hope to continue chatting.
Look forward to it. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Adam.